Good evening, and welcome once again to the Eclectic Radical. I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. With me tonight are Michelle Studer, who was the one who pitched us our topic tonight. So everybody thank her, please. And Rachel Kahn, whom I am so glad to see again.
Hello.
And I'm glad you're feeling up to streaming with me because you're one of my favorite people to stream with.
It's the face.
Michelle, go ahead and introduce yourself, since you're the person that anybody who's been watching me might know the least.
Well, my name is Michelle, as you said. I'm an artist based out of Metro Detroit. I'm a writer and also a performance artist. Although I haven't been doing too much performance art in the last couple of years-ish because of all of the COVID stuff. But as you can imagine, that industry is not doing super great at the moment. But
I can see that.
Yeah. And as things, so I guess I just, so I worked in a few different industries. I started out as, I trained as a journalist, and I ended up not working in that field because, well, there wasn't really money in this. This was in like the mid-aughts. And there was also just a lot of, to be honest, I was like sexually harassed a lot. And I didn't want a career filled with that. So I tried other industries. And pretty much the same vibe kind of goes everywhere. It was everywhere in my experience. And it's not unique to me. It's not unique even to I don't want to leave out anybody that's non-binary. So when I say like women are discriminated against, also trans people are discriminated against. It's a lot of the workforce is a boys' club in my experience, especially in what is considered male-dominated fields. And there's not really recourse for that. There are laws on the books that address it, but laws are only as good as who enforces them and to what ends. And so if you have a bunch of people in charge that are determined to uphold the status quo, it doesn't matter how many laws you have in the books. Doesn't matter, right? It's not gonna that isn't gonna protect you.
It's true.
So I guess maybe I just basically I certainly don't want to center myself in a conversation that is much bigger than me. But that being said, like my lived experience, that's the lens I can speak through, and that's what that's what I can do today.
If it's reassuring at all, though it's not to me, it's really terrifying. But if it's reassuring at all, it's not the first time that I have heard this. A friend and previous guest of mine, Brooke Binkowski, has said pretty much every time she's been on, journalism is a bunch of rich people and sex pests with the run of the newsroom, and everyone else tries to stay out of the way and pay their bills.
That's been my experience as well. And it makes me really sad to say that, but it's owned by a bunch of usually conservative leaning white men. I know they say there's a liberal media bias. Not really.
Not in the money.
Right.
So classical liberal bias, maybe.
Yeah. And even that is still the same small kind of centralized group of people that all kind of look alike and act alike and think alike and talk alike.
Oh, of course.
People who are either white dudes or sufficiently assimilated into white dude culture.
Right. Including a lot of white women, I would say, that uphold sort of those internalized sort of misogynistic attitudes. So.
Yes.
Well, one thing that I say that sometimes gets me upset is enough generational wealth will turn anyone white.
Oof.
Within limits. But we have a Supreme Court justice who is seriously considering, from all the rumors flying around and things he has said and things that were leaked in the Alito memo, we have a Supreme Court justice who is seriously considering declaring his own marriage unconstitutional in order to make the country more conservative.
Boy, yeah, obviously, looking like this, there's only so much I can speak to the Black experience. But I don't know that one necessarily. I think if you assimilate into whiteness the way that, for example, Clarence Thomas has, there are definitely cultural expectations and personal motivations. But I also think it's important to kind of understand within this context that, like, even this extremely reactionary, white, chauvinist, Western chauvinist movement, that is really insidiously taking over the government and very clearly has a solid lock on the Supreme Court right now. Even in as much as they prioritize themselves, they do have like the good ones. There are people they consider the good ones. Mm-hmm. And I think if you are willing to side with them, and this is frequently along class lines, along class loyalties, but if you're willing to side with them, it does provide you a degree of coverage, right? Because like we were just talking about a second ago, if the laws are on the books, it only matters in as much as they're being enforced. And that goes both ways, right? That also includes people who have power not having the laws enforced against them. Jeffrey Epstein, for example, until, he killed himself. Really, his logs, his client list would be the people here.
What's hilarious about the whole Epstein thing is he may not even have really been rich. He was just blackmailing rich people with all the dirt.
I mean... power,
living a sort of fake wealthy lifestyle in the same way that Donald Trump has without ever being as wealthy as advertised. And I'm bringing this up because it's not a new problem. King Henry VIII did find his divorce. And the reason King Henry VIII was willing to find his divorce is, number one, he was a man, and so were all the people he was asking to help him get divorced. Mm-hmm. And number two, he was the king. And people wanted to make him happy. And number three, I have to point this out because some people might not realize it right away. Official People's Party USA has nothing to do with Movement for a People's Party. Jim was using the name first, and Nick stole it.
Good to know.
I know nothing about this party, but thank you. Noted.
Movement for the People's Party, just like King Henry.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you have to understand that all controversies aside, King Henry VIII was actually king some of the time. And I'm not sure what Nick Brannon does.
Yeah.
Now, we're not going to talk about Movement for a People's Party anymore because that's not the topic. The only reason it would come up is if we need examples of institutional sexism down the line.
I noticed that in a lot of political parties, even third parties, like I hear a lot of complaints, and I'm not involved in anything specifically, but I do hear a lot of that. So again, like the same problems keep rearing their head, and until we address them, they will,
And we are not immune from it any more than any other group, because the simple fact is Lenin protected a sex pest in the Bolshevik Party from accusations of rape and harassment because he was a good Bolshevik. Mm-hmm. And Lenin believed that the revolution was more important than these sort of personal complaints people had against each other.
Yeah.
Even harassing one's comrades.
Yeah. I mean, I know you know my story with this one.
Yes.
And I'm assuming you're baiting me here, and I will at least slightly take the bait. Obviously, I was stealthed, which is a type of sexual assault, by a relatively connected, I wouldn't say he's well known, but connected podcast producer. And the person he was producing for threatened me to keep me silent. And I have been very careful speaking about this for a lot of reasons. The biggest one being that he threatened me to keep me silent. So, he scares me, frankly. I don't want to deal with the kind of harassment and attacks that I certainly would face if it came out like as a full-fledged war. I don't know if I want to talk about it right now exactly. So I'm going to set like a slight boundary there, but I will say I've certainly experienced it here. And you know, it sucks. And I think it's always very important to remember that, like, we can do these things. We do these things on our side. But also, like, even to my own end, even when it happened, I did really try to go for like mediation, because I do believe the party is bigger, the movement is bigger, you know, and I do really believe in, you know, remediation and in restorative justice. And I actually ended up having a really powerful conversation with a researcher who specializes in this, who said basically restorative justice doesn't usually work with sex pests. That unfortunately, these are people who have to be removed from their environment and relocated to one that does not accept that kind of behavior. And that the enabling of the community is really what allows them to act this way. And so there's no way to sort of scold them into behaving better. You have to materially change their environment.
And in basic plain English, for those of us who want it, for anybody who wants it simplified, you have to actually make people behave if you want them to behave sometimes. You can't. Yeah. If you tolerate bad behavior will get worse. There have to be boundaries. Mm-hmm. And some people will actually learn boundaries if given them, but have never been given boundaries before and have been enabled by everyone they meet their entire lives. If they're rich, it's worse. But if they're important to people in various ways, I mean, how many of us let things slide with our friends because they're our friends that we wouldn't let slide with anyone else?
Oh, yeah. It's hard, right? It's hard.
Well,
and that's talk a lot. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, right. I first of all, I'm really sorry that happened to you. Like that's garbage. And I think that most people that are women or non-binary have faced something like that. And I don't think all men are shitheads or anything like that. Sorry. Hopefully,
God, if only it was even the first time, right? Like,
right. But this goes on so frequently, over and over. I do hold individuals responsible for their behavior, but this is bigger than one person or one problem. And it is because people allow it to happen. They let people get away with it. They go, well, you don't want to cause trouble. Okay, maybe he didn't mean it. He didn't. Okay, well, maybe he didn't. But if he does it 12 times to a bunch of different women, then he did mean it.
There's a phrase that conservatives used to use a whole lot before they were suddenly the ones who were in all the weird sex scandals. But you used to hear the phrase, there's a culture of permissiveness here. Usually in scary tones from really right-wing people. But I mean, that's exactly our institutional problems in nearly all of what I would call, and I'm going to use liberal class, not to mean people who are actually liberal, but the people who can afford to be liberal and therefore are the only true liberals. Us poor people can't afford to be liberal. We can only either accept their liberality or demand socialism. But among the liberal class, there is a culture of permissiveness. If you are important, you are allowed to get away with stuff. If you are rich, you are allowed to get away with stuff. If you have lots of connected friends, you are allowed to get away with stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a little off topic. It reverses some tropes a little bit. But one of the things that most comes to mind these days when I think of culture of permissiveness is Joy Reid sitting there explaining that time-traveling Russian hackers altered her Twitter and she doesn't remember tweeting things. But if she did tweet them, she really, really apologizes. And one of her lifelong friends, who also happens to be a gay man, is sitting right there while she's apologizing for these homophobic things in her past Twitter. And then accepting her apology on behalf of everyone who might have felt offended that she was homophobic, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
That was the role he was serving.
Yeah, because he's one of the good ones.
Exactly. And this is the same thing. Everybody should watch Morning Joe at least once, even if they don't watch it regularly.
Do I have to?
I will say why. Because more than anything else, it is really an inside look in how these people think and talk when they're hanging out together. Because it's just a bunch of Washington elites and rich people in front of a camera, acting like they would almost if the camera weren't there. And obviously some things are intended for the camera and others are just them being them. But the combination of both is fascinating, especially when you realize that the reason Al Sharpton is there so often in the morning is to launder something horribly racist that Joe Scarborough says and make it acceptable to black people by saying it first and ascribing the things that more radical members of the black community actually say to what he calls latte liberals, by which he means white people. And so then Joe Scarborough is able to completely trash, say, police abolition, which is a concept created and spearheaded by black women, as something white liberals thought up.
Oh, yeah.
That's how they pervert the message, right? Is in general, and that's another example of that. And when I speak to internalized misogyny of women, I don't want to like make that. I don't want to compare two different levels of intersectional power divides, but there is, yes, part of the success of a lot of these sort of oppressive sort of status quos is by getting people who are themselves marginalized to go along with the narrative, either by personally promoting certain individuals that are more marginalized and getting, or and usually by having a few spokespeople, right? And when you elevate a few people of that marginalized class, they end up usually betraying whatever their roots are. And that also though influences other people that look up to them. And I would say that the same thing, I've seen the same thing happen, at least from my lens, with women that don't protect other women or that goes on. And I think that because people know they will get in trouble if they speak out, they know they will. I've gotten fired for speaking out against predators from jobs.
Hey.
And I was able to, how did I survive? I was lucky.
How many of the women at Fox News who complained about Bill O'Reilly or Roger Ailes still work there?
I don't think many. Some of them got
none. They're all gone. Some of them left. Some of them got fired for other things.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially in cases like that, you get fired for other things.
Yes, right? Because retaliation is illegal. But if you can't prove retaliation, most states in this country are now at-will employment states, which means they don't need a reason to fire you.
I do want to bring it like sort of back into our wheelhouse if we're talking about, examples of people who are betraying their marginalized classes. Abby Shapiro, I think, is a great example, right? She's this like archetypical, like pro-genocide, right-wing, trad wife Jewess, right? Which of course I am also a Jewess. So, and I'm buxom to boot. I've been called Abby Shapiro while people were harassing me in the comments of my own live stream. Because you see, I am the second big titty Jew they've ever seen in their life.
There's only one or two.
Yeah. There's like two of us and I'm the second one.
It's in the Talmud, it's in the Bible. I've seen it.
And she's building her brand on this, on building this brand of being the trad wife, of the happy stay-at-home mom, the traditional woman, who takes care of her skin and her hair and always talks with the most delicate voice and is just so in love with her husband and making him happy. And it's like this entirely constructed facade, right? And I mean, to an extent, all gender is performance, right? But like it's very much this sort of selling out process. And I mean, I think for every marginalized identity, you see this, right? And whether it is, a woman saying other women should be more chaste, should be more demure, should be more, obedient to their husbands, or a Jewish person saying that, genocide is okay when it's happening to Palestinians, right? Or voting for Donald Trump. Like, the party of Jews will not replace us in 2016, right? Whether it's any of those identities, the sort of power dynamic is the same.
But you have to understand, though, is that the thing about there is you know this, of course, but there is a symbiotic relationship between the most conservative portion of the American Jewish community and American right-wing anti-Semitic whack jobs. And that symbiotic relationship is the fact that both groups are absolutely and completely devoted to support for Israel for totally different reasons.
Sorry, my camera is shaking because my dog is on the bed having a dream and kicking her little feet. It's very cute. Unfortunately, it's not great camera work.
What kind of dog do you have? I love dogs.
Oh, she's a mutt. She's a Labrador Vizsla mix and just the light of my life. Her name is Asa, and she can do a spin kick.
I love Labrador mixes.
And she's dreaming real hard on my heart a little bit.
I'll say this. I don't care if you want to be a trad wife or whatever, but you don't get to dictate to everybody else how to be.
And that's really where the problem starts. Is I want to dictate my belief system onto everyone else because my belief system is the only belief system. Now, keep in mind that all our institutions were designed by men who thought their belief system was the only belief system. That belief system may have been this sort of secular humanist deism, if you like, but they still didn't think that there was any other correct belief system than their own.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, even if it's not strictly the religious sense, philosophically is a belief system, right?
Well, hey, there are certain philosophers whose work is so completely metaphysical that it is more religion than philosophy.
And a lot of them are overtly Christian to boot.
Well, one of the two greatest examples, absolutely, that was Leibniz, and Leibniz was aggressively Christian to the point where he hid his real philosophy in these private journals and letters to friends, and all his public work was ridiculously optimistic and tremendously typically Christian, but his private philosophy is almost atheist and really depressing. Whereas Spinoza, who was Jewish, who was not a practicing Jew, but who nevertheless, his philosophy is just so completely religious and Jewish at the same time, while at the same time not being religious or Jewish at all.
You'll never guess who my favorite theologian is.
Spinoza?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. It's a very Jewish conception of God. Basically, as if God exists, God is so far beyond our comprehension that they might as well not exist. Basically.
Well, I mean I
can't disagree.
I find it pretty reasonable.
I think that Isaac Asimov is probably right, and the creative force is probably the last computer left over from the people in the previous go around of the universe. But then he was Jewish too.
A friend of mine the other day gave me this nugget that I'm keeping forever because it resonated so wholly with me. Jews believe in, at most, one God.
Yes, I like that.
Yeah. It was one of those jokes that you just hear. It's like if you ask two rabbis, you get three answers. It's like one of those just jokes that is so essentially true about Jewish culture that it's like just like gut punch and you start cackling.
I was raised, for those of you who don't know it, in the Mennonite Church. The Mennonite Church is a dissenting peace church. For those of you who are interested in the really, really fun parts of the Counter-Reformation, ultimately the Mennonites were descended from the Munster Anabaptists, who may have been the first Christian anarchists.
Dope.
Interesting.
And the Munster Anabaptists actually took over the city of Munster in Germany for a bit of time and did things like outlawing traditional marriage, letting people who wanted to live together and cohabitate as if they were already married.
Mandatory polycules for everyone.
Well, not mandatory, but they definitely didn't have a problem with that. That one of the reasons that the Calvinists and the Catholics actually teamed up to crack down on them. How often does that happen? I mean, we've been seeing it again lately a lot, but it's been a long time. And the Calvinists and the Catholics teaming up is the fact that the diehard vocal advocates for anti-abortion and anti-gay politics are evangelical Protestants of a Southern Baptist Calvinist bent, and yet all the judges appointed to the federal courts in order to enact these policies turn out to be Catholics.
Funny how that happens, but this is also, I think, a really good segue to talk about family abolition, because I know I love the radical stuff. I love studying the most radical theories. Not even necessarily because I want all of them, but just because I think imagining horizons is helpful towards centering, the present. And especially as the Supreme Court of the United States is starting to really crack down on what a family is, what a family can be. Now the dog is scratching herself. I'm thinking of like Clarence Thomas explicitly saying they should go for Obergefell next, right? Like as that's happening, it's been a really odd juxtaposition to be comparing that with like family abolitionist theory, and this sort of idea that these sort of rigid expectations we have of nuclear, 2-generational families where there's just like the parents and the children, and there's the head of house in the master bedroom, and then the rest of the family sort of.
And let's not, since the official topic is institutional sexism, and this ties in, I just have to cut into the fact that what you call a head of house? A patriarch.
Yeah.
Under traditional Roman law, the head of the household was the pater familias, and was the highest ruling authority in the house. The state could not interfere with his conduct of the family business, which is to say, he could throw his wife out without her dowry, without anything, with just the clothes on her back. And unless her family was really, really powerful and important, and there wasn't a really big scandal attached to her, that he would get away with it. There were no consequences except whatever the social consequences were. Several people in the Republic, while it was a big scandal, several famous politicians executed their sons for crimes that those sons had committed. This was under the natural purview of the head of household. Right. The father, the head of the household, could kill his wife. He could kill his children.
That's still functionally true.
Purview. Well, that's what we're deliberately being driven back towards by the same forces that seated the current Supreme Court.
Yes. Well, and I want to tie this in as well to sort of the modern alt-right, because the forces that seated the Supreme Court is kind of the old right. That's like the Koch network.
So old right, I get very frustrated with this because Nazism in the United States starts with people deciding the year after Bacon's Rebellion that from now on we're going to call all the indentured servants overseers and pay them a little bit and treat them a little better and make them punish the slaves for us so the slaves will never team up with the indentured servants again.
Yeah. your freedom so long as you step on somebody beneath you.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And
Go ahead, Michelle.
I was just going to say that ties into, to me, that's just an extension of the system of capitalism, right? It starts in families where there's a hierarchy, and it's always one particular type of person, right? That's always making all the rules for everybody with no kind of repercussions, at least unless there's somebody else communally that decides that, right? But and then that leads to that happening in institutions, right? Because where do we learn all this stuff? We learn it in our families. We learn it of origin, right? So if you have a certain structure in your family, it's going to translate to institutions. And then it's going to be a systemic thing that is a cultural thing. And I feel like we're having the same arguments that people have been having for 1,000 years because we keep making the same mistakes and never addressing the issue, much less treating like the disease, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly how I became an anarchist. Like, the hierarchy is the problem. And it doesn't really matter what language you couch it in. It doesn't matter what mechanism of exchange you're building power around. If you maintain the hierarchies, you maintain the abuse of power.
That's right.
Right.
That's why
too.
That's why Lenin could protect sex pests, because while it was definitely preferable to the czarist system, and while arguably it might be preferable to our system, the Leninist system was still a hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
It was
better for whom, I would say. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's better if you're a guy on Lenin's team, but if you're one of the chicks being,
well, it's better. When I say better, I mean materially better for the average person on the street. Whatever else you want to say about communism, they had fewer famines. They had fewer famines under the communists than under the czars.
Right. No, I'm not against communism.
No, I know. Well, I know. And so when I say better, I just mean general material conditions, and I'm not really talking about the specific abuses of hierarchy. The abuses of hierarchy are never going to be good for the people being abused. That's just a fact. And as long as you have a hierarchy, there's going to be abuse, and that's why you need a way to organize without a hierarchy and horizontally instead. Mm-hmm. So that there's always somebody standing next to you who can slap your hand before the abuse happens.
Like, I'm all for structure, and I think organization and having, systems is fine, but how we go about those systems is key. And I don't know that anybody, I think what happens is anytime somebody tries to make any headway on this, it gets infiltrated, it gets, derailed, it gets, like what tends to happen is, there are people on the inside that tend to dismantle these things because they are corrupted by, I think that I'm trying to find the best way to put this, but I feel that until everyone can take like a hard look at how we put people into little categories with our labels and things like that, and admit that we all consider some people better than others based on the way that we are raised and the way that we are taught to think. Mm-hmm. And we are not going to dismantle any of this because we won't even admit our own biases and our own flaws and our own flawed ways of thinking, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with you. And adding to that, I would say it's very difficult if you are raised with these sort of unconscious beliefs about power and who should be in power and what like competency or intelligence or, ability looks like, then it's very difficult unless there is somebody there to sort of slap your hand and say, no, this isn't okay. It's very difficult to break out of those patterns of thinking. And I think that's why we see these sort of recurring patterns of, ableism, sexism, racism, white supremacy, classism, anti-parent sentiments, and, anti-sex worker sentiments sort of showing up over and over again across all spaces, right? It's exactly because we have these really deeply held, deeply ingrained beliefs that unless we really actively dig around in them and challenge them, we'll never reconsider. Which is like, kind of tying it back to the family abolition stuff I've been reading. I have a family. I have a partner. I have a beautiful kid. I love my family, and the thought of giving that up is horrifying to me. And then I read what family abolition actually is, and it's like, oh, this isn't about that. This is actually more about challenging, these ideas of what family has to be. And I go ahead.
I was just gonna say I don't know a lot about the theory of family abolition. But it's basically just like saying the nuclear family is
it's like anarchist free association, but for like homes. Like basically it's this idea that like these really sort of hierarchical institutions of family are
it's
harmful.
Free family.
It
would be a better way to put it. It's everybody has their own voluntary, everybody has the right to choose their family.
Yeah.
And those people have the right to be a family when they've chosen each other. And everybody within the family has the right to agree to add new members if everybody agrees.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's just how I live, so that's just me.
Right. Like I think I'm already doing that, but I just didn't like have
well, that's the thing is once I like read up on what it was, I was like, oh, this is kind of already how I live my life. Like this makes a lot of sense once I like actually looked into it. Which is so funny because, you would think I would learn, right? Because when I very first heard about police abolition, for example, my gut reaction was like, but we need the police, my pearls, and now I'm like fervently anti-cop. When I first heard about, polyamory, I was like, but how do they deal with all the feelings? And now I haven't been in a monogamous relationship since I was like 20 years old. Gosh, what are some other things that I mean, communism, right? When I first heard of communism, I was like, isn't that the Stalin stuff? And now I'm like stateless, classless, moneyless. Like, so it's all of these things I think tie in really nicely with it. And I think that it is understandable that when these things have these sort of, very negative connotations because of these cultural norms, because of these active cultural efforts to suppress these sort of subversive ideas, it's natural to have that sort of gut, like, but what about reaction?
To me, that sort of is like, I used to have thought, like there was a point that I didn't understand that the police were a death squad, basically.
Yeah, right.
But I was also indoctrinated to believe that. And I think that's the thing is when your lived experience doesn't match these sort of things that you've been taught, and then you start asking questions, you can go a couple of ways with that. And I think a lot of people do ask these questions, but then there's people kind of on the sidelines ready to kind of propagandize them back into it. You know what I mean? I see a lot of that as well on both the right and the left, like sort of no matter political.
I think we're seeing, I think we're seeing a lot of that right now, specifically with like the anti-trans movement within feminism, which is another great way, I think, to sort of talk about institutional sexism, right? Because so many of the strategies that, TERFs are employing, and that's trans exclusionary radical feminists, I'm going to put feminists in quotes too, because they're not really any of those things. Yeah. So many of the strategies they're using against trans people are founded in abuses that women suffer at the hands of patriarchy.
I still remember the time I made Rachel a little mad because I said, no, we need to stop calling TERFs because they're not feminists.
But the thing is, it rolls off the tongue so nicely.
It's true. Plus, swerf and TERF just is such a good pun.
Sometimes you got to like make concessions, and it's fine because now they're all mad being called TERFs anyway, and they say it's a slur even though they called themselves that in the first place. Like, whatever.
People like that are going to get mad at you no matter what because you're challenging them. Like I had an uncle that died of AIDS in 1992, and I was a child when that happened.
I'm so sorry.
And thanks. The rhetoric. I'm bringing it up just to say, like, the rhetoric that I'm seeing about trans people. They did that shit to my uncle, and we're calling him that, names. I'm not going to use the names, but as he was dying, and I watched the same thing play out now. But now the preferred scapegoat is trans people versus just a gay men dying.
So,
but it's the same playbook for me.
I'll take it a step further. We are seeing society do to trans people what it used to do to women. And I want to make that connection directly.
Yeah.
And the reason I want to make that connection directly is because, and this is why I say TERFs aren't feminists, and I know I'm a man saying this, but there's a reason lightning isn't striking me right now, and it's not just because there's one God at most. It's that if you actually examine history and understand why women's spaces exist as women's spaces in the first place, it's because men have traditionally banished women to woman-only spaces to preserve their male spaces.
Yes.
Sports is the best example, which is why the current wave in women's sports towards trans exclusion makes me so mad. Women's sports only exist because men did not want to let women play in the first place. Women's sports isn't some special fair category that exists so women can compete without having to be defeated by superior men. Women's sports exist because men were deeply frightened of losing to girls. And I'm putting it exactly that way because that's how every man thinks of it in the back of their head. They don't want to lose to a girl.
Well, think about it. You still hear it. What, are you going to lose to a girl?
Yes.
Like, you still hear it. That's still a thing that people say.
Yeah.
And it's
and so there's a story here that's really important to understand. Figure skating is an old sport. There were world figure skating championships in the 19th century. The first woman competed in the world figure skating championships in 1902. There were 14 total contestants in that tournament. 13 of them are men and one was a woman. A man won. The gold medal winner was the best figure skater in the world at the time, undisputedly in everyone's mind. There was no way any of the other men had a chance of beating him, and they knew it. And nobody expected him to do anything but come in first. Second place was the woman. Her name was Madge Suarez. The other 12 men all came in behind Madge Suarez.
right.
Now remember, the winner was the undisputed best figure skater in the world. This is like beating Elvis Stoico in his prime for anybody who knows anything about Winter Olympics. Nobody expected anybody but this guy to win. So when she came in second, she was the winner in the minds of everyone, in the sense that she was the second best in the world. She was the one who would win a tournament if he wasn't in it. Now, the worst part, from the point of view of the people who had to run the tournament the following year, the best part to me, this part makes me laugh to no end. The winner said that the judges were bigoted against women and that she had easily beaten him and deserved first place.
She probably did.
Well, but that's the whole thing. She probably did, yes. But the reason they canceled it wasn't just that athletes were pissed off because she came in second and beat them. Judges were pissed off because the best figure skater in the world, who everyone expected to win, was now saying they deliberately picked him over a better skater because of who he was.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, God, figure skating is such a perfect example too, because it's score based and it's judge based.
Yes.
So there's nothing, objective about this. Like, this is, how much do I aesthetically appreciate the movements of your body? And if you hate the body, can't really appreciate the movements of it, right? I think a really good sort of modern analog to this would be how many men think they could beat Serena Williams in tennis.
Yes. But what's hilarious about that is that, if we actually did, if they actually put a trans ban in professional tennis, that someone would have immediately gone after the Williams sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And what's
people
more,
already say the Williams sisters are men.
I know. So I'm old enough to remember when Chris Evert fans, she's divorced. When Chris Evert fans said that Martina Navratilova was a man.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's
the big turd.
Like if somebody's too good at something, or a woman too assertive or too bold, they're called a man and told to shut up.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was worse. The Chris Evert's coach in one tournament actually submitted a demand for Martina Navratilova to be physically inspected in front of both sets of coaches so that it would be proven that she was not a man.
A genital check, if you will.
Oh, yes. So like the state of Ohio is doing on children now.
Yes. Well, they're doing this about an adult woman, and they were implying that Czechoslovakia would have deliberately suborned this huge fraud on the public. It was all very gross. And not just gross, but sexist, because you're saying a woman can't be that good.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And this is really where it comes down to. The belief is that women can't be that good. Mm-hmm. Therefore, men can't compete against women. Because if men were to compete fairly against women and women ever won, then that would be, because women aren't that good, that would be deeply painful to the men involved.
Yes, because that means they must be awful. It can't possibly be that they're among the best in the world and somebody happens to be better than them and also a woman. Mm-hmm. No, it's that it must mean they are lesser.
The women's baseball league was shut down because male minor league owners were losing money to women's baseball teams owned mostly by major league owners.
Yeah. Yeah.
There were some local owners too, but most of the women's teams, most of the teams in the women's league were owned by a handful of men in the major who own major league teams. The most important of which was Philip Wrigley, who owned like half the teams in the league at one point.
Yeah, I mean, God, if there was any industry that deserves to be collectively owned, and of course they all deserve to be collectively owned because private ownership should be abolished. Well, team sports generally. Team sports generally. You know who can probably say with a really high degree of authority what's best for a team? The team.
Players. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really excellent sort of analysis of the psychology behind this, and I think we see
I'm a man. I've gone through some of this myself.
Oh yeah.
I outgrew it, I like to think, but no, I have experience with these thoughts. I'm a guy.
For sure. And I mean, I think that's helpful. And I think it's also really useful to point at what's happening again with, the anti-trans movement. And I want to keep bringing it back to this. And I'm going to pointedly keep doing that because I'm a firm believer that trans liberation is gender liberation. In the same way as with all liberation, you center the needs of the most marginalized people and in the process liberate everyone. So I'm going to keep bringing it back to that. But I think this is also really useful because we are seeing that same sort of existential and almost ontological anxiety in TERFs, in these women who are aggressively excluding trans women, in spite of the fact that trans women across the board are treated worse than cis women are. Like, it's like the only way to be lower in the pecking order is to be a woman who is trans.
And yet you will never get a TERF to admit this.
Of course not, because they cannot acknowledge that their unique plight is not only not unique, but actually kind of.
I mean, I hate to play this card because it's unfairly using the class card to devalue gender discrimination, and that's not really what I want to do. But I mean, when you really look on it at a basic level and you look at who the TERFs are and what their position in society is, and what their position in academia or business or politics may be, are the TERFs themselves really the best example among women, even cis women, of being oppressed?
I think the sort of TERF intelligentsia might be, but I think that's kind of the intelligentsia. I'm very tongue-in-cheek here, but I do think that has more to do with who gets representation and who's visible than necessarily who comprises the TERF ideology and movement. Because these kinds of movements are carried out by millions of people.
Well, but and
there's just not enough
about
space.
False consciousness, but that'll take us off topic.
Slightly, but I think we could bring it back around, because if I'm guessing, Michelle, go ahead. I see you trying to go.
No, I agree with everything that you guys are saying.
Man, and you're fat, so you can get hired.
Yeah.
You can yell that. Sorry.
I think it was a commentary about you could be a man and be fat and still get hired. Is that
Well,
right?
my wife was saying that because my wife is a big woman. My wife was saying it's a woman interviewing with a man and immediately a fat woman interviewing with a man and immediately knowing whether she's going to get hired or not.
Mm-hmm.
True. Well, and that's the thing. I think what it all comes back to, like we're saying, TERFs. I mean, anybody that's gonna like exclude a group of people just out of hand, and especially a historically marginalized group, I am automatically loses my respect, because that just is telling me a lot of where you're coming from. But they've also been raised on a lie as well, so I have empathy for that part of it. What I don't condone, and where my empathy runs out, is when they refuse to examine their own beliefs and come to some harsh truths about the system they've grown up in. When they lash out at the marginalized group, then they themselves are becoming oppressors. So not to say that like there aren't people that are considered TERFs that have themselves been mistreated or lied to or even marginalized up to a point, but now you are punching down in terms of intersectional power dynamics, and that's what makes them abusers and what makes their argument illegitimate, in my mind, anyway.
Now, this is what I was going to get at when he says, I wouldn't be surprised if class plays a role in being a TERF. And it's important to understand, and I use this word very broadly. I already described it as starting with slaveholders in America. But Nazism is very much a middle class movement. And by middle class, I mean Marx's petty bourgeois, or what I call the small landlord class, or the small owner class, to use simpler words. The people who own a little bit, but who still have to do some work themselves, even though they own a little bit.
Well, and they ultimately have more to lose.
Yes,
because if they lose their wealth, they lose their security.
More importantly, the people that we would think of in these movements as disadvantaged or poor are usually not working class or criminal class people, but are rather people who have been thrown out of a higher class due to economic failure. A lot of the Nazis were people who had failed at business.
Yes, and they need somebody to blame.
A lot of Nazis were small business people who resented big capitalists, but who absolutely didn't want communism.
Right, because then they lose what little they have, right?
And
their little sliver of power.
America has a huge problem with false consciousness.
Yes.
Which is working class American people define themselves as middle class, while a certain group of actually well-off people comparatively define themselves as working class. And what's worse is that media and many Americans let them do it and further this problem. The best example I can think of still is during the 2008 presidential campaign, a celebrity was born, Joe the Plumber. Now, Joe the Plumber was a reasonably rich guy with $1 million in the bank who owned his own plumbing business. He was not Joe the journeyman plumber who works for Sam the rich guy.
Right.
He was Joe, the guy who owns the only plumbing business in town, in just a big enough town that he has enough customers to stay busy, which makes him successful. He was one of the local gentry where he was, but because he was a plumber, because he still did plumbing himself, he was a working class guy to himself and his friends, and more importantly, to the media when he shot off his mouth at some John McCain event, and thereby became a celebrity as this working class advocate for conservatism. He was a boss. He was not a worker. He was a boss.
Yeah. I think there's also a really great example in Nick Fuentes. Who we all need to learn a lot more about Nick Fuentes, because
tell me about him. I've heard the name. Not good things.
So Nick Fuentes, he is sort of the originator of the America First marketing campaign, for lack of a better word. That's mostly what it is. He comes from a wealthy background, grew up in a very wealthy area, kind of had everything before him. He has, for lack of a better word, a cult of personality around his ideas. He's sort of where this like Western chauvinist idea is festering, for lack of a better word to describe it. And, the people in his movement are the grapers. They are the ones you see like on 4chan, on, Paul on 8chan, who are having the actual sort of planning sessions for things like January 6th, which I saw Torfin Zempel, hope I said that right, mention. And also your comments generally have been great. Thank you for those. His group is Nazi-ish. It's Nazis. They aren't necessarily eugenicists, but they're sort of like cultural eugenicists. So they do have like good ones in the sort of sense I was describing earlier, but they also...
The anti-immigration Western chauvinist movement is actually Nazi in its origins.
Oh, absolutely.
Even if they don't necessarily actually advocate eugenics.
Yes.
The founder of what's the name now again? The founder of a major anti-immigration nonprofit was also the president of an extremely pro-eugenics chapter of the Sierra Club in Michigan, and was president of Zero Population Growth back when it still called itself Zero Population Growth. He believed very strongly in what he called passive eugenics.
Yeah.
You guys will have to tell me if this sounds familiar.
I know the guy you're talking about is what's
John
killing me. John Tanton. Yes, thank you. Thank you. God, killing me. And yes, this is a descendant of that, to be sure.
Passive eugenics is the idea that, number one, you give the cops a whole lot of money and starve social services. Number two, you crack down really hard on the border and don't let anybody in from outside. And number three, you don't really try that hard to keep people alive when a pandemic, when some sort of disease or disaster or crisis hits. Do any of these things sound familiar to anybody experiencing life in 2022?
Gosh, maybe one or two of them. And so, I think this ties in well with the America First people too, because that's exactly what they're doing. It's really particularly funny because, you know, Nick Fuentes obviously is Latino, but
Larry Elder is Black. Larry Elder is a specific student and disciple of John Tanton.
Well,
David Horowitz.
Really?
David Horowitz from the neoconservative Bush administration, not the consumer advocate with the same name. David Horowitz was a student and disciple of John Tanton.
Right.
Stephen Miller, who, all jokes aside, and all things you might say about Biden versus Trump aside, Stephen Miller is a genuinely bad person and definitely a Nazi.
Yeah.
Stephen Miller is a disciple and student of both Larry Elder, whose show he used to call Every Day, and David Horowitz, who he worked for briefly. So you've got all these connections to people who have been important in either shaping the minds of people who make policy. Larry Elder's show used to be really big once upon a time. It's not nearly as big now, thank goodness. But Larry Elder was huge in Southern California.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the audience is still there and it's still regenerating. It's just they've moved on to newer people. Like,
welcome, Alex.
Hello.
Hey, sorry I was late. I let you know in advance, Chris. I had to go help a friend out with something. So
I didn't understand what you were saying, but now I figured it out.
Good to be here.
So yeah, one of the things I wanted to mention while I was talking about America First, because I think this is like maybe the most important part, is once you dig a little deeper, the veneer drops. And they are saying, you know, their mercy for the Jews is forced conversion to Christianity. You know, they don't hate Black people. They just want them to be in their place, which is subservient. You know, they don't hate women. They just insist that women are subservient to them and chaste except for with them. You know, it's all of these very sort of self-aggrandizing ideas. And it stems more than anything else from their own belief in their personal supremacy, which has always been the case.
As long as they control your experience, they like you. If not, you're the problem. That's what it boils down to for people like that. And it's obviously yeah.
And to that end, I can see why, like, the idea. Oh, they're also actively anti-democratic. They do not want to have a democracy. Like, openly, they think democracy is bad because too many people cannot be trusted with power. The fact that they can be, and they're the only ones who can be, is
they would know since they're abusing it, right?
right. So I think part of what makes trans people so threatening in this context is that they are actively, just by existing, challenging all of these ideas about these hierarchies. You know?
I mean, so let's say you're a macho, white supremacist, big on the notion of masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about trans women just on a basic, I don't want this in my space reaction, even if you don't have any deeper, if you don't have any deeper ideology, the very fact that you worship masculinity so much, someone who you see as a man insisting that they are a woman is...
Yeah, I mean, when you're born as a
really
god,
hitting you in your most fragile place.
Yeah.
That's the way to put it.
When you're born as a god, any deviation from godhood is an apostasy. You know, like, they see these people as like fallen angels almost, you know, that like they should have been better than this because, you know, they were born as me, and why would you have this thing that I have and willingly give it up, right? It never occurs to them, of course, that the reason you do that is because having it is actually worse than not having it.
Yes.
You know what I don't get either is why does God have to have a gender? Like they always refer to God as he, and even referring to God as she. Like I'm not sure God even has a gender. Maybe just referring to God as creator or something. So it's really important to understand that the Bible refers to God as he because the people who wrote the individual books of the Bible could not imagine anything other than an anthropomorphic God. And they said that women stem from the man's rib or something.
Well, yeah. Well, Eve was created from Adam's rib in the Genesis story.
They don't talk about his wife Lilith, though. By the way, there's right. So Adam was married before Eve. He was married to how Lilith put up with that crap. Right? They just don't repeat. So
yeah. Well, and I guess in the sort of great domestic struggle, masculinity won and Lilith was cast out, right?
Well, wasn't Lilith a redhead?
Probably not.
No, probably.
If based on studies of the earliest human beings, Adam and Eve were almost certainly black.
Yeah.
I mean, the folks in England, what's now England, it wasn't England then. The folks in England didn't start being white until like around the time of the Ice Age or a little thereafter.
It makes sense because that's when there would be like a real chokehold too on like migration.
Yeah. And even past that.
But so I guess extreme cold affects pigmentation of the skin over generations, right?
I'm not going to speculate on reasons.
I don't know the epigenetics there, but I do know that it makes sense. Like that the rapid environmental changes, especially relative to different regions, would create different adaptations. Like that is the kind of thing you see fairly consistently in animals all across the spectrum of life. So
what I don't get is these right wingers love to quote Darwin, but Darwin
they don't understand Darwin.
Well, yeah, Darwin never talked about social Darwinism. That's just an invention of.
There was actually, I'm going to mention a podcast that I love, and they don't even talk to me yet. I'm going to get them to talk to me. It's called Seriously Wrong, and they just did an episode about this, and it's great, and y'all should all go check it out. And they talked specifically about survival of the fittest and what fittest actually means. Because so many people assume that fittest means winner, right, in this competition for life. And what fittest actually means is least worst. Like you got lucky and didn't die is what fittest means. Yeah. So
the most adaptable are the ones that survive, not the strongest in the
survivors. Right, the survivors are the ones who are best able to adapt to their environment on an individual level, regardless of the reason.
Yeah.
And the survivors' traits are the ones that get passed on because they survived.
I mean, for example, dolphins are more intelligent than us. They have larger brains. They use more of their brains. They have an advanced sonar system of communication. Of course, if they had feet, they would run the world. They would run us.
And they're mean, too. They could take us probably in terms of
they've also saved human lives, right? They're not that bad because, when there's shark attacks, the dolphins encircle the humans to protect them.
Sometimes, but I mean, they also like rape fish for fun. So,
Yeah, I've heard they have a dark side too.
They have their they're also intensely violent. They're very similar to us, actually, in that way. I love dolphins, though. I think they're cool.
And of course, apes are stronger than us. You get in a chokehold with an ape, you're done unless you put it in them and put them to sleep.
This is
true.
And
I think actually bringing it to apes is really, really helpful because the thing we see over and over again societally, evolutionarily, is that society is adaptive. Having a group of people working together consciously, intentionally, is how we became anything. So, these sort of fiercely individualist notions and these sort of ideas of fit and fitness as sort of inherent ontological strength and not just sort of luck of the draw relative to a set of circumstances. That feeds this idea of superiority and of, eugenics and really all of the sort of ugliest parts of this and sort of rigid social control around this.
Well, in medieval Europe, the fatter you were, the more attractive you were. That applied to women, because they showed that you were rich, that you had money to buy a lot of food, and it was actually considered attractive in that time.
The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow has now taught us that that contrary to the bullshit historical record, the very first cities were almost certainly anarchist collectives, and the notion of kings and aristocracies comes from the barbarian nomads who eventually conquered the cities.
Mm-hmm.
Which is directly relates to the fact that Rome was a republic before it was an empire, that Rome's kings were foreigners elected by Roman citizens rather than Romans.
Mm-hmm.
Weren't the Roman kings originally from Troy?
That is the myth. The Roman kings were Etruscan. Several of the first Roman king whose existence can be proven historically, not the mythologically first Roman king, was a Sabine, which was a Latin tribe related to the Latin tribe that became the Romans and very closely settled to them in the same part, to the point where Rome was originally, quote unquote, half Roman and half Sabine, and the two groups eventually became one over time. And
even that is such a good example, though, that the cooperation is what did it.
Yeah,
it was the forming of a larger community and working in larger groups that did.
And they also controlled people with language, because Latin is very easy to learn. And so that was the language of the empire when they expanded. They Latinized.
And then the Etruscan kings came later, and most of the famous kings of Rome are Etruscans.
Looks like Michelle went out. Hopefully she's back soon. But anyways, for example, the destruction of Troy by the Greeks. The myth goes the survivors of Troy that fled, that they helped build the city of Rome. That's a myth. That's not true.
That was the history written by Livy and the mythology written by Virgil, both of whom worked for Augustus. And Augustus was really good at this propaganda stuff. I mean, Augustus really sold his being the first emperor as restoring the republic, and people bought it to the day he died.
Well, they killed his uncle in the name of restoring the republic. Isn't that ironic? Julius Caesar. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and so I break greatly from the usual analysis when I say this, but I mean, if the Roman aristocrats had just been able to bite their tongues and mind their egos and not stab Julius Caesar, things could have been so much better.
Well, the city of Paris was named after the Trojan prince Paris, right? So there might be some that they fled all the way to Gaul, what's called the time in France.
So the thing you have to understand is that Rome was shaped by class warfare. Literally, in that the seminal portion of Livy's history of Rome is the chapters about the War of the Orders, which is all the political wherewithal between the patricians, who were the high nobles who ran the government in the state and got to sit in the Senate, and the plebeians, who were everybody else.
Proletariat.
And the proletarii were very specifically the poorest plebeians who did not own any property. There were rich plebeians, so that's more complicated, and they came later.
They were petty bourgeois plebeians.
Well, there were extremely wealthy plebeians too, and the reason for that was aristocrats could not legally sit in the Senate if they had any business interests but income derived from property. So you could only sit in the Senate if you were a landlord. If you were a business person, your ethics were immediately suspect. Because they believed trade was something plebeian, to be literal.
Well, they only let the Jews lend money. That was the job that.
Well, the Romans had bankers.
The Florentines too, but I'm saying for some time in medieval Europe, it was after Rome.
Jewish money lending is a Christian. Jewish money lending is a Christian thing.
Yeah.
Jews were forced into that position by Christians, basically.
Yeah. So that stereotype that Jews are good with money, ironically, was actually imposed on them because that was the only way they could survive. Because the Christians said, we don't want to deal with usury or lending money. We'll let the Jews do it.
They threw the Jews out of the trade guilds. And after the Jews were thrown out of the trade guilds, they no longer had the legal protections of the trade guilds, and they were vulnerable to whoever wanted to come by and kill them. So the kings everywhere in Europe at the time all swooped in at the same time and said, we're the protectors of the Jews, which of course meant that they made the Jews act essentially as unwilling treasury officials. And
in the Middle East, the Jews thrived as doctors, and even Saladin's doctor was a Jew.
They continue to do that now, for what it's worth. Lots of Jewish doctors and lawyers, and just at a cultural level, we really highly prize college education specifically, which is why Jewish areas tend to also be very highly college educated.
Yeah, so it's like later in the Islamic world, Jews were permitted to have very, very important positions, while in the Christendom in Europe, at the same time, they were discriminated against.
I can't help but wonder, though, to what extent that was still, even back then, a function of assimilation. You know, to what extent are Jews being in high positions just the Jews who were very assimilated?
Well,
right.
I wonder
that too.
It's true. Because obviously, if you're Jewish in this position, you speak Arabic.
Right.
If you're Jewish in this position, you are comfortable enough with the habits of court to be willing to mix with Gentiles at court. I mean, let's not forget, mixing with Gentiles was kind of a big deal to Jewish people in those days. And so you sense? Had, what was that?
A big deal in
there
what
were
sense?
Strict limits on there were strict limits on I'm trying to remember.
Why are you thinking about that? For example, everything that is kosher, Muslims can eat. So if a Muslim family went to a Jewish family's home and they were prepared kosher food, it would be halal as well, because it's so similar.
There's a great deal of overlap in the dietary laws. Yes,
not everything that's
origin. I mean,
like there's certain seafoods that Jews can't eat that the Muslims still eat, but everything that's kosher, Muslims are permitted to eat. It's a very similar diet.
Yeah, well, we share a cultural origin, right? Abrahamic faiths. And I think those sort of religious deviations happened alongside migrations, right? So Jewish people lived kind of around the Mediterranean. And if you have a shellfish allergy and you suddenly die, you know, I could see people looking at that and going, that's the thing you don't eat, because I don't want that to happen to me, especially if they don't understand it as an allergy.
And refrigerated, they didn't have refrigeration. Pork caused a lot of damage.
Pork has to be cooked very, very well and specifically in order to be safe to eat. So you see someone get trichinosis, you're going to say, let's not eat pork.
Exactly.
That's how they say. That's how Mozart died. That Mozart had a huge feast of pork, and back then they didn't have the medicine to take care of the worms into his body. If
that's true, then Salieri has gotten the worst rap for the least reason in history.
That's from the movie. That's from Amadeus. I mean, they were rivals, but I highly doubt that he poisoned him.
Yeah, right.
I was not aware that Mozart may have died of bad pork, but that's
Makes sense.
It's true. It's true.
Well,
Right.
also because he was a partier, he drank alcohol all the time. He was working all the time when he wasn't drinking, and so he had a weakened immune system. So that, and the combination of his diet and the worm spreading through his body, killed the poor guy. He was pretty young. He was in his 40s.
Yeah.
And
Especially like 300 years ago or whatever. Right.
Yeah, they didn't have the medicine that we have now. Now, if you have bad pork, you take a pill and it kills the worms inside.
Well, I mean, it's called ivermectin.
I know it's true. It's just what a good punchline, huh?
But isn't that the medicine now they're saying that cures COVID? That's just absurd.
Well, they're not saying that anymore. But yes, that was the one that was being pushed. So
the one that Trump was pushing, I think. Yeah.
And then somebody tried to claim, well, that's just ivermectin rebranded, about the actual pills that work and cost a fortune. And no, it's not.
I want to actually, Torfin, you made another great comment, and I want to talk about it because you were talking about Jews being chief advisors to medieval Arabic empires. And actually, there's some really cool philosophical history behind that, because the Islamic tradition at first was very much one of like debate and questioning and, really engaging critically with the Quran and with the teachings of, Muhammad. And, that was sort of the origin of like the, Muslim Renaissance, right? Of like the inventors of mathematics, was because they had that kind of culture, which was very simpatico with Jewish culture.
The mystics, just like the Kabbalists in Judaism, the real mystics that took from Pythagoras and took numerology and all that stuff.
Yes, exactly. And all of these things that sort of were able to coalesce because of that sort of culture of debate. And then Christian culture happened. And Christian culture is intensely hierarchical. And it's about obedience, and it's about, execution of power. And that deviation from the sort of Abrahamic tradition is all these other horrible things.
And then this is where that I offend people by saying, but is that really Christian or is that Paulian?
Well, let's talk about the Inquisition real quick. The German and French Inquisition was more brutal than the Spanish. It's largely ignored historically. It was broader in scope. It was much more persecutorial. It went after witchcraft. The Spanish Inquisition was brutal, but it was very specific, primarily against conversos, the Jews that stayed in Spain and that converted to Christianity, and also some Moriscos, some people that families were originally Muslim. So it tortured some of them that they suspected were still practicing their religions. But in Germany and France, the Inquisition was very broad. In the Catholic Church in those countries, anybody suspicious of witchcraft, any neighbor you didn't like that you would rat on, they would go and they would torture you. It was very, very broad.
Joan of Arc was killed by the French Inquisition, not the English.
Yeah.
They were working together, but it was the French who ended up killing her, ironically, right? And then they made her a saint in the Catholic Church, even though the Catholic Church killed her.
Well, it's really complicated because the French Church and the French king were not super friendly at the time. The French Church kind of recognized the English claim to the French throne because the treaty had been signed and witnessed by the appropriate bishops of France. And so the French clergy were kind of like, yeah, the King of England is really the king before God because they made all these oaths and signed all these papers and the bishop put his seal on this stuff. That sort of thing mattered to the church in those days.
Yeah, man, if that doesn't still have a direct cultural descendant in like paperwork nerds.
Yes.
Nothing has changed. Just the words we use to describe it.
By the way, Joan of Arc was way after Charlemagne, right?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Charlemagne, the first French king. I mean, some of his descendants ruled after him, but this was post Charlemagne, right? When they got Joan of Arc.
Oh yeah, Joan of Arc was long post Charlemagne. Yes. Yeah. Joan of Arc was breaking. They were still the Angevins when Joan of Arc came by. They weren't even the Valois yet.
You guys can tell that Chris and I love love going off on tangents.
So I grew up in the Methodist Church. I'm not a Christian. I'm agnostic. Just FYI. I don't really know if there's a God, and I don't really pretend to have any answers for anybody. But I will say that, there's something with all of these faiths that I feel like I know. The loving God of the New Testament, per se. There are Christians that believe in love and honor and justice, and there are good people in the religion, but I do think the religion itself is basically about control ultimately,
So,
in certain factions.
I will go really. I'm going to put on my preacher's son hat here. My mom is a preacher, not my dad. Let's be really clear about that. But with my preacher's son hat on, I will say that that a lot of the stuff that we think of as Christian is actually Calvinist.
Mm.
That Calvinism is really specific, and that there are a set of Calvinist beliefs that if you understand, you look at all this Nazi-ish stuff and you go, oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it's important to understand that whereas Jesus is talking about this universal salvation for all Jews and potentially all people, that Calvinism is talking about the salvation of the elect.
Mm-hmm.
And the elect are the people who, even though original sin exists, the elect are the people who have been chosen to go to heaven because of God's eternal love. And therefore, these people are going to go to heaven no matter what. Now, the sick and twisted part of all this is that the people who thought up the idea of predestination said very explicitly, it's precisely because everyone is sinful, and so everyone deserves to be punished, but God is loving, so some people will be saved, that causes this to be a completely random choice, because everyone deserves to be punished for the same original sin, and these people are only saved by God's grace.
Jesus loves us this much, and this much is exactly as big as he can hug everybody into heaven.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Just for the record, I do not support any of those, but I'm not defending in any sense.
No.
I understand.
But the reason that I'm mentioning that specifically is because if you understand the idea of the elect, and that only the elect are going to heaven, and that therefore, in its modern parlance, the elect are better than everyone else,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore deserve to make the rules for everyone else, you see exactly where all this ties into all the funky Nazi shit.
Yeah, because ultimately it's about control. That's what all this stuff boils down to.
Yeah.
Control. Other people.
It boils down to control.
And
it boils down to the idea that some people deserve control.
Mm-hmm.
That they deserve to be in control, and that other people are less than them.
There's actually a great Netflix documentary about this called The Family, and it talks specifically about the modern iteration of that sort of religious, self-aggrandizing, will to power community, which continues to exist now at the highest echelons of power in the United States.
Yes.
So anyways, there's a David Bowie movie coming out, and I looked at a David Bowie quote the other day, and he said, religion is for those who fear hell. Spirituality is for those who have been there. So I liked that quote. And something I put up on Twitter the other day, I think Chris responded to it. I was talking about religious rules when it comes to abortions, and actually, it's permitted under different circumstances in Judaism, unlike Christianity. Didn't you look into that, Chris?
Which?
I put out there that in Judaism, abortion is actually permitted.
Well, not just permitted, is that the interpretation of some rabbis, as stated by the church suing the state of, as stated by the synagogue, suing the state of Texas over its abortion ban, is that Judaism requires saving the mother's life, even if it means an abortion. And therefore, telling Jewish women they can't have abortions is a violation of their Judaism.
Yes. Well, and even within the Catholic tradition and the Christian tradition, and this is directly taken from Jewish cultural history, because in Judaism, there is a very sort of central theme of breath and breathing and like the connection between that and language, like God is the word, that whole thing. Yes. But in the Christian tradition, life begins at first breath.
Yes.
And there actually is nowhere in Christian theology where abortion is like explicitly, forbidden. There is nothing
in Christianity. There is in Calvinism, and there is in Catholicism.
Yes.
Now, in Catholicism, the specific ban is the idea that every life is precious, that life begins not at birth, but actually at the moment of creation, in which God set in motion all of the biological processes that make life possible, which is to say that every fetus that ever gets fertilized was meant by God to be born since the moment of creation.
But even then, they're internally inconsistent because they won't baptize a stillborn.
Well, and and that's a whole that's a very fair statement.
The last rites to the stillborn, but not baptize it.
But the idea is that that life is ordained by God and therefore precious and valuable and should not be prevented.
It's almost like original sin is just in the air as miasma. Like you take your first breath and you have sinned.
Yes.
How do you get out of that, right? How can you argue that, right? If somebody says your whole existence
really, and that's where, in a modern sense, there's actually a very good thread on why people idealize the unborn when they don't appear to care about the people already alive. And what it comes down to is it's very easy not to be failed by people who haven't been born yet. The unborn are the one group that will always be worthy of you and will never let you down. Once they're born, they can let you down.
They also don't have a voice, right? So you can project whatever your beliefs are onto that whole,
And you're speaking for them, you say, but really you're saying whatever you want.
Also, when you put politics and religion,
Alex.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just said that way the fetuses don't have a voice, right? So anybody can speak for a fetus if that's already here and claim whatever about it, and the fetus can't say, actually, that's not true.
Right.
So it's the perfect thing for someone to project their own beliefs onto using the lens of, this pure innocent life. And I would believe these people, if they did care about the fetus once it was born into the world as a baby, and then there was care for the child that then existed after birth. But they don't care once you get here what happens to you.
I put pro-life in quotations because of that, yeah.
Well, if you believe that children are inherently innocent and therefore go to heaven if they automatically free pass, if they die while they are still innocent children, then at what point does it become counterproductive and actually harmful for their souls to save their lives?
I wanted to make a quick point too about mixing politics with religion. A lot of people refer to being Machiavellian, right? And it's usually in a negative connotation, referring to Machiavelli. What a lot of people don't know is that Machiavelli was advisor to Cesare Borgia, who was not only a cardinal, and the cardinals vote who the Pope is. He was the illegitimate son of the Pope, of Pope Borgia. And Machiavelli wanted Cesare to be the king of Italy. The name of his book was The Prince. Yeah, so that was a direct link between, you know, the religious order in the Vatican and Machiavelli and the advice he was giving to whoever would be the prince or the king
It's also worth understanding that Machiavelli was a Florentine Republican who hated the de Medicis and who actually had an office in the Republican government installed in Florence by Cesare Borgia after the de Medicis were kicked out. And that Republican government was allied to Cesare, and it was in the capacity of working for Florence as an ambassador that he became an advisor to Cesare Borgia. And then when he wrote The Prince, the de Medicis were being invited back to Florence. And
I think Cesare was exiled to Spain.
He wrote The Prince.
Borgia was dead. His father was dead.
Cesare was dead by the time The Prince was published.
Oh, okay. He was also dead. I know he died in Spain in battle, yeah.
The Prince was written as a gift for Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was coming back to Florence to take the reins of government after the de Medicis had been kicked out. And basically The Prince was written because Machiavelli, having worked for Cesare and having worked for the Florentine Republic, was now hoping to get a job with Lorenzo. And it didn't work out. But he wrote a very good history of the War of the Orders in Republican Rome, Machiavelli.
Within The Prince itself, because I only read The Prince.
Well, The Prince itself is pretty cynical and very much written in.
You're saying that Machiavelli wrote other things. Okay, I've only read his known book. Okay,
he wrote other things.
Because I like to understand how the enemy thinks. I mean, this is how the people in Washington and all empires think. They think in the Machiavellian way. So I don't read it out of any admiration for Machiavelli. I read it to understand how they think.
Well, I don't even know if they actually think in the Machiavellian way, though. I think it might actually.
Or their warped version of Sun Tzu.
Well, yeah, exactly.
The Godfather was based off the Borgias as well.
Yeah, but I think it's a bespoke cultural lens, right?
Yes.
I think it incorporates a lot of different elements and a lot of different philosophical underpinnings, all of which have been sort of warped around this central will to power.
Definitely. And that will to power is what matters.
Well, Trotsky said the ends may justify the means, but the means need to be justified. And Machiavelli simply said the ends justify the means.
Machiavelli said Machiavelli said something that Cersei Lannister said better in Game of Thrones. You win or you die. That's the game that Machiavelli was writing about at the time. Machiavelli
hated neutrality as well. He thought neutrality was cowardice.
You win or you die. Those were the stakes in those days. What happened to Cesare Borgia? He died.
Well, Cesare died by suicide. He went into a battle that he knew he was going to lose because he knew he could never return to Italy. Yeah.
So my question is, when do the power struggles end with the centralized power structures that have been going on since, the beginning of time? When do the people get to say, actually, this doesn't work for us, and these hierarchies are really helping anybody, including the power at the end of the day?
When Americans and Europeans are willing to learn from Zapatistas and Kurds, and not until then.
I think that is very well put. I also actually need to run here, so I'm just going to wrap it up with when the most marginalized among us are liberated.
Yes.
Agreed.
And just right back into my original thesis.
And we've gone long enough now that it's probably a good time to start wrapping up. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, it was so great being here. If I didn't have my kiddo here and have to get her to school in the morning, I would probably sit here until 2 in the morning. But
thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with all of you. I really got a lot out of it.
I really appreciate you asking to come on. Please feel free to ask again sometime. I will try to remember to ask you. This was really good. I like to have discussion shows with people that folks will recognize because they've been on here before. So just let me know and we'll make it happen again.
Michelle, by the way, I love your earrings.
Thank you.
Yeah, they're dope. Solid earrings.
Yeah, gotta have a little
solid
flair.
Points that you made. I appreciated your contributions a lot.
Thank you, and same to all of you. Thank you so much.
We'll make sure to watch the entire show later as well. I'm sure it was fascinating.
No, it was great. I really enjoyed it. I want to thank both of you for coming. Rachel, of course, to let me know anytime you want to come on to talk about something too. I'm always happy to have you.
It's always great to be here.
And so I hope everybody else got something from our talk. I hope you all enjoyed the show. Everybody have a good night. And as always, we'll tweet at you.
Peace.